Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name's Alves and I'm your bookworm, and today we are going back to book reviews and we are reviewing the end, or at least the last book published in this fantastic series that is A Song of Ice and Fire. Yes, I'm talking about A Dance with Dragons by George R.R. Martin. Now, everyone knows Game of Thrones, the amazing and very famous TV show that premiered a few years ago, and there was an adaptation of the book of the same name, A Game of Thrones. That was the first book of this series, which is so far a 5-book series called The Song of Ice and Fire. This is an epic fantasy. Some might call it an anti-fantasy. I personally prefer on the epic fantasy side because there's a lot of epic battles and epic moments overall. But anyways, I've read and reviewed the first 4 books. You can check them out on the channel through the thumbnails or the cards up above. And watch them and then come back and see the review of the last one. So this last book, A Dance with Dragons, came out in 2011. That means almost 14 years, or actually 14 years ago, which is crazy to think that so long has passed since the publishing of this book. I mean, still no sign for the next one in the series, and honestly my opinion is that it will never get published, but one can always hope. And by 2011, this series had already gotten quite famous. I don't remember if the TV show had premiered or not by then, but I remember in the book world, people were starting to talk about how big and how good this series was. But I mean, of course, it would never get as big as when the TV show premiered and everyone was watching it. But anyways, as it stands, in that year, this book got nominated for 7 awards. And it ended up winning some of them, such as the Locus Award or the Goodreads Choice Award for the fantasy section. And speaking of Goodreads, on Goodreads, this book has over 725,000 ratings, which again, Game of Thrones has always these hundreds of thousands of ratings, which is always good to see because we want to see fantasy books receive this much attention. And the average score it has is a 4.34 out of 5. Again, really good overall, so that's what we expect from George Martin at this point. I think only the 4th book was a bit lower, but all the other ones had similar scores, so that is always good. But let's get on to our housekeeping items. Just if you're new, I'm gonna narrate the synopsis here just so we can all be on the same page in case you've never read this, even though I don't know how you've never read this, but I mean, you might be young and this might be your first venture in Game of Thrones, and you might be curious, should I end up reading the 5th and then reaching the end without knowing the end, or is it not worth it? So I'll just narrate the synopsis tiny bit. Stick around. If you don't want to hear anything because there might be spoilers, of course, just jump through to the next timestamp and you'll avoid all of that. Let's go. In the aftermath of a colossal battle, the future of the 7 kingdoms hangs in the balance, beset by newly emerging threats from every direction. In the east, Daenerys Targaryen, the last scion of House Targaryen, rules with her 3 dragons as queen of a city built on dust and death. But Daenerys has thousands of enemies, and many have set out to find her. As they gather, one young man embarks upon his own quest for the queen, with an entirely different goal in mind. Fleeing from Westeros with a price on his head, Tyrion Lannister, too, is making his way to Daenerys. But his newest allies in this quest are not the ragtag band they seem, and at their heart lies one who could undo Daenerys' claim to Westeros forever. Meanwhile, to the north lies the mammoth wall of ice and stone, a structure only as strong as those guarding it. There, Jon Snow, 998th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, will face his greatest challenge, for he has powerful foes not only within the Watch, but also beyond, in the land of the creatures of ice. From all corners, bitter conflicts reunite, intimate betrayals are perpetrated, and a grand cast of outlaws and priests, soldiers and skin changers, nobles and slaves will face seemingly unsurmountable obstacles. Some will fail, others will grow in the strength of darkness, but in a time of rising restlessness, the tides of destiny and politics will lead inevitably to the greatest dance of all. And that was it for Synopsis. I think the synopsis sounds so epic. It really gives you the feeling of, okay, big things are about to happen in this book. But before we jump into the actual review, let's just refresh the scores I gave to the previous 4 books so we can have a sense more or less how things are going. How am I liking rereading this series, because this is my reread, my first reread actually. I read these as they were coming out, I mean, as The Dance of Dragons was coming out, but that was 14 years ago, so I thought it was a good time for a reread. And as you can see, the results so far have been pretty good. The series has never faltered beyond the 4.2, and even the 4.2 is quite high for a series overall. We've had a 5, we had a 4.8, a 4.6, so there has been a bit of everything. I think categories such as the writing style, which has always remained perfect, and also the plot and the characters are just those technical things that make this series just brilliant. Of course, the last book was a bit less enthusiastic or less enjoyable because we all know exactly why, and I'll discuss this throughout the series, the review of this book, and I'll get to it. But yeah, so we have these results and you can see, and let's just move on to the categories, which the first one is plot. So first thing I need to say is that this book is a chunky. I read this book the first time in Portuguese, and the Portuguese editions are split into two, and they were released at different times. It wasn't like the whole book was released at the same time. So I read the first half, and I think only months after did I read the second half. And I think that allowed me to separate a bit, myself distance from the story and not realize how big it was. But this time around, I was reading it in English and it was just one big book, and it took me quite a while, but also because I was like, Jesus, I never realized how much content exists in this book. But anyways, this book complements very well with the previous book, A Feast for Crows, because A Dance with Dragons pretty much follows the characters we didn't get to see in book 4. Although towards the end, I would say the last third, we start seeing this merging where we start seeing both the characters that have been throughout this book, like Daenerys and Tyrion and Jon, but then we start having also other perspectives like Cersei or Jaime, where we get to see more of what's happening to an overall to Westeros and the other continents. But this still makes me question the decision that George Martin took of splitting the plot into book 4 and book 5 in terms of geographics, because I think these two books would have benefited a lot more if they were done chronologically. And maybe George Martin didn't know what was going to happen in the future, and that's why he wrote book 4, and then only when he was writing book 5, he thought, oh, maybe I could do this happening at the same time. But anyways, in the previous video for A Feast for Crows, someone commented that there's actually a guide that tells you what chapters you should read if you want to have a chronological enjoyment of this story. And I definitely think that that would benefit just your experience of the story, because you would experience it all happening in a chronological order, which is the order that makes sense, and there would be more of a balance of the slow plot lines with the faster or the more plot twisty ones, let's say. And that's because I think this book, A Dance with Dragons, has a lot more plot twists, has a lot more surprises, and it keeps you guessing, but also keeps you gasping towards the characters that you like, because so much is happening that didn't happen in book 4. And of course, on top of that, we also follow characters that are usually more favorites like Jon and Daenerys and Tyrion. So that seems immediately that fans will be guiding towards that book specifically because of the characters as well. And one thing I have to say is that George Martin continues weaving beautifully the character arcs together with the plot arcs and makes it just one seamless arc, let's say. You can't distinguish one from other. You can say that it is the plot triggering the character development, or if it is the characters triggering the plot to move forward. It's just one does the other and they synergize to create something better. And if you think there haven't been enough dead characters, then prepare yourself, because of course George Martin couldn't write another Game of Thrones book without killing more characters. And whether you're a fanatic for plot or not, I would definitely recommend this series just based on the plot, because it's so surprising, it's still inevitable at the same time, and you can truly enjoy this masterpiece just looking at the plot. So for this category, I'm going to give it a 5 out of 5. And following plot, we have the character category, and what I said pretty much of plot can be applied to the characters. I'm glad that George Martin decided to have a wider cast, in the sense of a cast that is split along more places, because that allows us to not only see how the characters are evolving, but how their decisions will impact other characters that are quite distant, and have all these interactions happening at the same time. Because some characters do a certain action and that might impact directly another character, but it might not. And even if it doesn't impact that character, that character will still talk about that other event and what they think of it. And that helps us to connect with the characters. It helps us to realize what their goals are, what they are paying attention to, all of those things, which makes the characters feel more realistic. I mean, George Martin just excels at creating characters, from the despicable ones to the ones you love the most. I think it's impossible to stay unbiased towards any of the characters. You will either feel some love or some hate, but you will feel something towards them. Of course, there are characters that have arcs that are a bit less exciting or less fast, but that is not a bad thing, because if complementing well with the other arcs, then it allows you to rest a bit, see another side of the story, even if it's more plotty in the sense of political intrigue, or if it's just traveling along. You get to rest before you go into more serious or more intense parts. And I think this book is one of the few where the balance between these super active plot lines or character arcs and the ones that are slower is very well balanced. And I never felt that any character was going around in circles, that they weren't evolving, that they weren't changing. So there's always something moving along in the story. So overall, for this category, I'm giving it a 5 out of 5. Midway, let's talk about world building. And I think in this book, it was probably one of the ones we traveled the most around this universe. Although at the same time, some of the characters that we were following were always stuck in the same place. But for those that were stuck in the same place, we get to see this dynamic of the city, of the intrigues that happen, the cultures. Whereas with the characters that travel, we get that sense of exploration, that newness of seeing new places and discovering new things. And I think, again, George Martin was able to balance it very well between the exploration and between the sitting down and political intrigue type of plots. And then we have the pseudo magic of this world. And I say pseudo because this is something that I think George Martin does well as well, which is it seems to be magic, but at the same time, you can never fully prove that the magic exists. Someone can see visions, but the visions aren't always what they expect them to be. Something might seem magical, but at the same time, you never know what it is. I mean, there are certain aspects that you know are magical, like dragons. You cannot deny the dragons, or the White Walkers, you cannot deny those. But then, for example, the Red Priests, they seem to be in a very gray zone where some seem to be completely faking it, while others seem to really have powers. But of course, this book also suffers a bit from the split between the fourth and the fifth, because we don't get to explore much of Westeros continent, the Seven Realms themselves. And because of it, it suffers a bit on that aspect. And I think for this category, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5, simply because it would have been a lot more coherent if this book and The Feast for Crows were together, and it would have been a more seamless journey. And what about writing style? Well, this category is where the split comes into play. Because in my opinion, it was truly a writing choice in terms of pace, which I think it was a choice that did more harm than good, but it's not like he can do anything now to fix it. I mean, there are these chronological guides where you can read the chapters in a chronological order and have a better sense of the story. But aside from that, it was just a choice. Maybe it didn't pay off as much as he thought it would. That's about it. But I mean, I can imagine that this book, for example, if they don't like a specific character, if they don't like Daenerys or Tyrion or Jon, which I think are the 3 characters that have the most time in this book, then maybe they'll also think that this book is boring. In my opinion, I didn't think it was bad, but that's because I'm also biased. Daenerys is my favorite character. But aside from that, I think George Martin's prose remains beautiful, with the descriptions being just fully realized in my head, and also just the history that it seems so rich in this world, which is also part of the world building, but how he writes it without seeming boring is also part of his writing style. So for this category, I'm gonna give it a 4 out of 5, simply again because of the split. It would have been more coherent if the split didn't exist, and if the 2 books were just split in a random point in the plot where it could have been a good ending, but still everything in a chronological order. And the final category is enjoyment. And I know I've been complaining a lot about the split of the books between 4 and 5, Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons. But the fact is, I actually enjoyed this book a lot, especially on a reread, because the first time I read it again was when it was released, so many years ago. And of course, I had forgotten a few details. So when I was rereading and I was refreshing on those details, I could get these haha moments or those, oh, I know it's gonna happen soon. And of course, that's a good feeling to have anytime. And yeah, like I said, I didn't realize how big this book was. I remember just reading it and then thinking, oh, we must have been like halfway already, and then checking in. No, actually, we're still at the first quarter of the book and there's still plenty to read. But the fact is, I was happy for it because I was enjoying reading the book. So for this category, I'm gonna give it a 5 out of 5. And that finishes our review. Just as a refresher, we have 5 for plot, 5 for characters, 4 for world building, writing style, and 5 for enjoyment, which gives us a final score of 4.6 out of 5. I mean, this book isn't the best of the series, it is also not the worst by far. And I think my view on the book is positive, because if you compare my score with the Goodreads, which was 4.34, my score is way higher than that. But as you can see, I totally recommend you to read this series, read this book, it's really fun. And I mean, it's a series that the scores never go below a 4.2, so maybe you'll just not enjoy it as much on one of those books, but you'll still enjoy it. And I mean, if we average the scores of the 5 books, this series has an average of 4.64, which is really high for a 5 book series. But yeah, now we just need to wait and read the other 2 that are supposed to come out one day. But let me know what you think. Have you read A Dance with Dragons? Do you think it's overhyped? Do you think it should receive a better score? Comment down below and let me know. If you're new, don't forget to subscribe, like the content, and you shall be seeing me on Thursdays and Sundays, okay? See you soon.